Ruth Calder had been in Vale Basin less than 10 minutes when she saw a cowboy give up the only warm place beside the freight room stove to an old man with shaking knees. His coat was torn from shoulder to sleeve, and cold air showed through the split. The old man lowered himself gratefully onto the bench. The cowboy stepped back toward the open loading door. Wind pushed dry leaves across the platform outside. Beyond the freight yard, pale grass ran toward distant blue mountains. Ruth watched him pull the torn coat tighter. Then she opened her sewing case. "You'll lose half that sleeve before sundown." The cowboy looked down at himself. That bad? Worse. His mouth moved slightly at one corner. Ruth pointed toward an empty crate beside the wall. "Sit." He glanced at her gray traveling dress, then at the small trunk near her boots. "You just come in on the stage?" "Yes." "And you spend your first 5 minutes ordering strangers around?" "Only damaged ones." That earned a short laugh. He sat. Ruth moved behind him and examined the tear. The brown wool had ripped along an old seam and pulled loose across the shoulder. It had been repaired before, badly. She searched her sewing case. Black thread was too fine. Brown had nearly run out during the journey. The strongest thread she had was blue wool. This won't match. Will it hold? Yes. Then match doesn't matter. Ruth threaded the needle. The freight room smelled of pine crates, cold iron, and coal smoke. Men carried sacks through the wide doorway, while a clerk shouted numbers from a manifest. Ruth worked quickly. The cowboy sat still. He did not twist around to watch her. He did not try to make conversation merely because she was a woman traveling alone. That suited her. She tied off the last stitch and brushed loose thread from the shoulder. The blue line stood bright against the worn brown cloth. There. The cowboy lifted his arm carefully. Better than new. No. He looked back at her. Better than it was. That I'll accept. Ruth closed the sewing case. She had expected someone else by now. For 6 months, letters signed Gideon Vale had crossed between Ohio and New Mexico territory. The man who wrote them had described himself as a ranch worker with steady wages, a small line cabin, and more work than comfort. He had not promised romance. Ruth had liked that. He had written that he wanted a wife willing to build a life beside him, not serve one already finished. She had answered, because those words sounded less dangerous than promises. Now the stage horses were being watered, freight was being unloaded, and no Gideon Vale had appeared. The cowboy stood. Waiting on somebody? Ruth looked toward the road. My intended husband. His face changed only slightly. Mail order arrangement? Yes. You know what he looks like? No. That small corner of his mouth moved again. Ruth narrowed her eyes. You find something amusing? Maybe. Then enjoy it privately. He removed his hat. Gideon Vale. Ruth stared at him. The old man beside the stove coughed into his sleeve. Somewhere near the loading door, a crate struck the floor with a hard wooden crack. Ruth looked at the blue stitches running across Gideon's shoulder. Then she looked back at his face. You let me mend your coat before introducing yourself. I didn't know you were Ruth Calder until you opened that trunk tag toward me. And after you knew, I was curious. About what? Whether you'd finish. Ruth picked up her sewing case. You should have introduced yourself. You're right. No excuse followed. That stopped her. Most men she had known could turn a poor choice into a speech before admitting fault. Gideon simply lifted her trunk. Cabins 9 miles north. Ruth stepped beside him. Do you always make such poor first impressions? Only when I'm trying. She almost smiled. Almost. They married 2 days later, in a small territorial office beside the freight road. There were no flowers. Ruth preferred it that way. A clerk signed the record, Gideon paid the fee, and an older couple from the supply store witnessed the ceremony before returning to their wagon. By sunset, Ruth stood inside the line cabin that would now be home. It was larger than she expected, but plain. A narrow iron stove stood near the center wall. 2 chairs faced a square table. Shelves held flour, beans, tools, and 3 books with cracked leather spines. A second small room had been built onto the back. Gideon set her trunk inside it. "That room's yours until you decide otherwise." Ruth turned. "We're married. I know. You expect me to sleep separately?" "I expect you to decide when married starts meaning more than paper." She studied him. There was no nervous grin, no performance. He pointed toward the stove. "Damper sticks. Lift before you turn it." Then he went outside to feed the horses. Ruth stood alone in the quiet room. Her fingers found the edge of the sewing case. For years, she had worked in a textile mill office, where the owner praised patience whenever wages were late. "Be loyal. Trust the company. Things will improve." Then one winter, 3 weeks of pay vanished behind a locked office door. Ruth had learned something from that. People asking for trust usually knew something they had not told you. Gideon had already hidden one thing today, even if it was only his name for a few foolish minutes. She decided to remember that. The following weeks settled into work. Gideon rose before daylight. Some mornings he rode west toward the cattle range. Other mornings he checked pumps and fence lines miles from the cabin. Ruth learned the garden plot, the water barrel, the feed shed, and the stove. She repaired torn grain sacks before mice found them. She shortened a curtain that dragged across the floor. She mended a glove Gideon left beside the wash basin. He never asked. He always noticed. "Thank you," he said each time. Nothing more. The blue-stitched coat became part of him. He wore it everywhere. By late October, Ruth began riding with him, when his work stayed near the central range. That was when the small things started. At a windmill, 3 miles north, Gideon examined a cracked pump housing. The bearing should have been changed last spring. A ranch hand named Eli frowned. "How would you know when it was last changed?" Gideon crouched beside the base. "Because the grease seal is older than the replacement schedule." Eli looked away too quickly. Another day, Gideon stopped beside a nearly empty hay shed. "How many stacks came in from the south field?" The foreman answered, 6. There should have been 9. The foreman looked at him. Not like a worker being questioned by another worker. Like a man measuring how much the other one already knew. Ruth noticed. She said nothing. The oddest moment came near dusk at a remote windmill station. A young ranch hand was tightening a bolt when Gideon asked why the pump had been left running dry. The hand muttered, "Your place ought to know about this, Mr. Vale." He stopped. Gideon looked up. The young man swallowed. Gideon. Ruth stood beside her horse with one hand resting on the saddle horn. The windmill knocked slowly overhead. Clank, clank, clank. Gideon rose. Neither man spoke. Ruth looked from the worker to her husband. The blue stitches on Gideon's shoulder were bright in the last light. For the first time since coming west, she wondered whether the torn coat had belonged to a poor cowboy at all. Ruth did not ask Gideon about the ranch hand's mistake on the ride home. She wanted to. The question followed them through the cold evening air, while their horses picked along the wagon road. "Your place, Mr. Vale." The words would not leave her. Gideon rode half a length ahead, blue stitches visible across his shoulder whenever he turned. At the cabin, he carried water before supper and split kindling beside the stove. He behaved exactly as he had the day before. That made it worse. Ruth set 2 bowls on the table. "Do the men work for you?" Gideon stopped with the wood box open. "They work for the Vale outfit." "That wasn't what I asked." He put the kindling down. "No." The answer came too quickly. Ruth looked at him. "No, they don't work for you?" "No, not in the way you mean." "What way do I mean?" Gideon rubbed his thumb once across the blue stitching at his shoulder. Ruth noticed. "I've got responsibilities around here that aren't simple to explain." "Try." "Not tonight." Her hand remained on the back of the chair. "That answer has caused me trouble before." His eyes lifted. "With me?" "With men who thought information belonged to them because they had the office key." Gideon stood still. Ruth sat. "If it affects me, I expect to know it. It will. When? Soon. She looked at the untouched bowls between them. That word bought 3 weeks of unpaid wages at the mill where I worked. His face tightened slightly. I'm not your old employer. No. Ruth picked up her spoon. So don't sound like him. For the next several days, Gideon left before sunrise and returned long after dark. He said he was checking northern stations. Ruth did not stop him. She also stopped pretending his explanations satisfied her. The first snow came lightly, no more than white powder caught between sagebrush roots. 3 mornings later, someone knocked at the cabin door. Ruth opened it to find a broad-shouldered woman in a faded black coat, gray hair pinned beneath a wool scarf. I'm Martha Pike. Ruth had heard the name. The Pike lease sat several miles east on Vale land. Come inside. Martha shook snow from her boots and entered carrying a folded notice. I was told your husband sometimes knows who to speak to at company headquarters. Ruth looked at the paper. What happened? They raised my winter grazing charge. How much? Nearly double. Ruth looked up. Martha's mouth had become a straight line. My husband and I leased that section 12 years. He's dead 6 years now. I've never missed payment. She removed a small tobacco tin from her coat. Inside were folded receipts. Every piece had been pressed into a narrow square. I don't want charity, Martha said. I want the terms I agreed to. Ruth read the notice. Payment was due in 5 days. Failure would terminate winter grazing access and require the Pike household to leave the company cabin. Who signed this? Amos Kincaid. Ruth knew the name. Everyone did. Kincaid ran the Vale outfit from the central office near the supply yard. Gideon came in before noon. He stopped when he saw Martha. What happened? Ruth handed him the notice. He read it once, then again. His expression barely moved, but his fingers tightened around the paper. Did Kincaid send this himself? His clerk delivered it, Martha said. Gideon folded the notice. Give me 2 days. Martha frowned. For what? I need to check something. Ruth watched him. There it was again. Information behind a closed door. Martha took the notice back. I've got 5 days before he throws me off. He won't. Martha's eyes sharpened. You sound certain for a range rider. Gideon did not answer. After Martha left, Ruth stood beside the stove. You told her he won't. I know. How? Ruth. No. She folded her arms. You don't get to use my name as an answer. Gideon looked toward the window. I need 2 days. You may take 2 days. She reached for her coat. I'm not taking them with you. He turned. Where are you going? To Kincaid's office with Martha. I'd rather you didn't. That makes one of us. Ruth, this is bigger than one lease. Then someone should tell the people whose homes are attached to it. Gideon stepped closer. I am asking you to leave it alone until I understand what Kincaid is doing. And I'm asking why you think you have the right to investigate him. He said nothing. That settled it. Ruth left. The company office stood beside the largest feed yard in the basin. Black smoke came from a short iron chimney. Inside, wet coats hung from wall pegs, and a coal stove clicked with heat. Amos Kincaid sat behind a broad desk. He was nearly 50, clean-shaved, dressed better than any working rancher Ruth had seen since arriving. A small brass watch rested in his palm. He closed it when Martha finished speaking. The winter terms were revised. After I paid summer rates based on the old agreement, Martha said. Costs increased. Whose? Kincaid leaned back. The company's. Ruth stepped forward. Then why are your feed stacks lower than they were last month? His eyes moved to her. You are Mrs. Vale. Yes. Something passed across his face. Brief. Controlled. Your husband should have explained that ranch accounting is complicated. My husband explains less than you might think. That interested him. Ruth saw it. Kincaid checked his watch again. The notice stands. Martha placed both hands on his desk. I need until spring. You have until Monday. Over the next hour, Ruth learned Martha was not alone. 2 other families had received higher charges. A bunkhouse roof had been leaking since summer. A pump repair had been postponed twice. At the supply yard, Ruth counted haystacks. There were fewer than Gideon had said should be stored by November. When she returned home after dark, Gideon was waiting. You went. Yes? What did you find? Ruth removed her gloves. Enough to know you already suspected it. He looked away. She stepped closer. You know what Kincaid is doing. I know pieces. And you still won't tell me why. I will. When? His silence answered before his mouth did. Ruth went past him. The next 2 days, Gideon rode farther than usual. He returned with mud up his boots and frost on his collar. He checked the north feed shed, the western pump station, 3 lease cabins. He spoke little at supper. On Monday morning, Martha arrived again. This time she was not alone. A wagon stood behind her. 2 company riders followed it. One carried a hammer. The other held a board painted with the words, "Lease terminated." Ruth pulled on her coat. Gideon was already gone. She rode with Martha. The Pike cabin sat under a low ridge where wind pushed snow hard against the fence. Kincaid stood outside. He checked his brass watch as the company man lifted the termination board. "Stop," Ruth said. Kincaid turned. "This is company business. So was the notice you changed after summer." His jaw shifted. The rider raised the hammer. Then hoofbeats came fast from the western road. Gideon rode into the yard. Snow clung to his coat. The blue stitches crossed his shoulder like a bright scar of thread. Kincaid stared at him. Then he removed his gloves. "Mr. Vale," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was told you wouldn't interfere until your inspection was complete." Ruth did not look at Kincaid. She looked only at her husband. Ruth kept her eyes on Gideon. The yard seemed to narrow around him. Martha stood beside the wagon. The company rider still held the painted board in one hand and the hammer in the other. Gideon dismounted. "Kincaid," he said, "take that notice down." Kincaid did not move. "You said you wanted the inspection finished before you changed operations." "I did. And now? Now I've seen enough." The rider lowered the board. Ruth looked at Gideon's coat. The same worn brown wool. The same blue stitches she had put there with her own hands. Everything else about him had changed in a single sentence. Kincaid's mouth tightened. "You understand what this will signal." "I understand exactly what it signals." Gideon turned to Martha. "You're staying through winter under the terms you already paid." Martha studied him. "Do I thank the range rider or the owner?" Gideon looked once toward Ruth. "The owner should have stopped this sooner." He faced Kincaid again. "Send the men back." Kincaid checked his brass watch. "This is 1 lease." "No." Gideon stepped closer. "This is every increased winter lease, until I review them myself." That finally cracked Kincaid's calm. "You don't know what you're undoing." "I'm beginning to." Ruth waited until they were halfway home before speaking. The horses moved slowly through thin snow. Gideon rode beside her, not ahead. "You own it." "Yes." "How much?" His gaze stayed on the trail. "Most of the basin floor, the central grazing range, the supply yard, the bunkhouses, the north hayfields, water stations from here, almost to the western ridge." Ruth let out a short breath. "And you told me you worked for wages." "I do work. That wasn't my question." "No." He looked at her then. "I never drew wages from anyone." She stopped her horse. Gideon stopped too. Wind pushed loose snow between them. "When were you planning to tell me?" "After I knew what Kincaid had done. That could have taken months." "I thought it would take weeks." Ruth stared at him. "You decided that?" "Yes. You decided when your wife was allowed to know who she married." He looked down once. "Yes." The answer hurt more, because he did not fight it. Ruth turned her horse toward home. At the cabin, Gideon made no attempt to follow her inside immediately. He unsaddled both horses first. When he finally entered, Ruth was standing beside the table. Her sewing case sat open. She was not sewing. "You said the men didn't work for you." I said, "Not in the way you meant." "You knew exactly what I meant." "Yes." He took off the coat and hung it by the door. Ruth looked at the blue stitches. "Why marry me while you were doing this?" Gideon was quiet. "Because I had already written to you before my uncle died." That was new. My uncle ran the Vale outfit for 12 years. I worked cattle in Colorado because I wanted no part of managing this place from an office. When he died last spring, control came to me. And Kincaid stayed on as superintendent. Everyone told me he was efficient. "So you came back pretending to be a ranch hand?" "I came back working as one, while letting everyone believe you had no authority." "Yes." She rested her fingertips on the edge of the table. "You could have told me." "I should have. Not I meant to. Not I was protecting you. Just that." Ruth looked away. "I need more than that. I know." The next morning, Gideon rode to the central office openly. No one called him simply Gideon. Ruth went with him. She did not stand at his side. Not yet. She watched. That mattered more. Inside the office, Kincaid laid out figures across the desk. Reduced hay purchases, delayed roof repairs, higher lease charges, fewer hired hands. Every number pointed in the same direction. Profit. "You inherited an operation carrying too much cost," Kincaid said. "I corrected it. You shifted the cost onto people who couldn't absorb it. I kept the outfit solvent." Gideon picked up one sheet. "You cut winter feed reserves. I reduced excess. How much remains?" "Enough if the weather holds." You nudged toward the window. The sky had already gone gray. "Winter doesn't sign contracts." Kincaid tapped another page. "This does." A cattle delivery agreement lay beneath his hand. Ruth watched Gideon read it. His expression changed. "Not much." "Enough." "What is it?" she asked. Kincaid answered before Gideon could. 800 head due south in 12 days. Gideon looked up. "You committed that many after cutting reserves?" "I committed what the outfit needs to sell. If the North Range freezes early, we'll need those stores for cattle staying here. Then the lease families can buy their own feed." Ruth stepped forward. "After you doubled their charges?" Kincaid ignored her. Gideon did not. "Ruth." She looked at him. "What? How many families did you hear about besides Martha?" "2 directly. More were mentioned." "Names?" She gave them. Gideon wrote them down. It was the first time he had asked her what she knew before deciding what he would do. That evening, they rode to the northern bunkhouses. One roof leaked along the back wall. A stovepipe had rusted through. 2 windows were boarded with grain sacks. Gideon stood in the doorway, looking at the room. Ruth ran her fingers along the damp bunk frame. "This wasn't missed last week." "No, it was missed all summer." "Yes." She turned. "What happens now?" "I repair what can be repaired. And the rest?" "I decide what gets paid for." She watched him. "Before or after you tell me?" His eyes met hers. "Before I decide." Ruth nodded once. It was not forgiveness. But it was movement. For the next week, Gideon changed the way he worked. He stopped disappearing before dawn without explanation. He laid supply counts on the table at supper. He asked Ruth what she had seen at the lease cabins. She told him which families had poor roofs, which had enough fuel, which were short on flour, and which refused charity but might accept work. He listened. Then came the northern rider. He reached the cabin after dark, horse lathered despite the cold. Freeze is moving faster than forecast. Gideon was on his feet before the man finished. How long? Before morning. And the Pike families, already heading toward the winter bunkhouses. The rider swallowed. Kincaid locked the supply yard. Gideon's face went hard. "Why?" "Says nothing gets released without advance payment. Says the cattle contract comes first." Ruth looked toward the window. Ice had begun forming along the lower glass. Gideon reached for the brown coat. His thumb pressed once against the blue stitching. Then he looked at Ruth. "If I break that cattle contract tomorrow, the outfit takes the loss." Ruth pulled on her gloves. "And if you don't?" Outside, the wind struck the cabin wall hard enough to shake the latch. Gideon opened the door. Then people pay for a decision they never made. He stepped into the cold. Ruth followed him. Part 4. By the time Ruth and Gideon reached the Vale supply yard, the gates were already crowded. Wagons stood nose to tail along the frozen road. Families from the northern leases had arrived with blankets, grain sacks, children bundled deep in wool, and whatever food they could carry before the temperature dropped. Ranch hands moved between them, without knowing whose orders to follow. The supply barn doors were chained. Amos Kincaid stood beneath the yard lamp with his brass watch in one hand. "You're late," he said. Gideon dismounted. "Open the stores." Kincaid closed the watch. "No." Ruth saw several men turn. Gideon walked toward him. "That wasn't a request." Kincaid lowered his voice. "You release that feed tonight, and the south shipment loses reserve weight before we even start moving cattle. Then we cut the shipment." A murmur moved through the yard. Kincaid stared at him. "That contract is worth more than these winter leases combined." Gideon removed his gloves. "They're not numbers on the same page. They are to the outfit." "No." Gideon looked past him toward the families waiting beside the wagons. "They became the outfit's responsibility when we charged them to live and graze here." Kincaid stepped closer. "You haven't run this place a month." "That's true. You don't understand what your uncle built." "I understand enough." Kincaid pointed toward the barn. "You open those doors. Buyers in Santa Fe hear about it before the week is over. They'll mark Vale cattle unreliable. You'll lose thousands." Gideon looked at the ranch hands. Most had stopped working. Every face in the yard had turned toward him. He raised his voice. "My name is Gideon Vale." Silence spread through the crowd. "I control the Vale Basin outfit, the leases, the feed yards, the grazing land, the winter bunkhouses, and the cattle contract Kincaid is talking about are under my authority." Ruth stood near Martha Pike's wagon. The blue stitching on Gideon's shoulder caught the yellow light. A man near the barn slowly removed his hat. Then another did the same. Gideon continued. "I spent weeks riding this basin without telling most of you who I was." His eyes moved across the yard. "I wanted to see how the place was being run when nobody expected the owner to be watching." Kincaid's mouth tightened. Gideon faced him. "That was my mistake." Kincaid blinked. "You mean trusting me?" "No." Gideon's voice stayed level. "Thinking I could stay hidden while decisions made under my name hurt people who had no way to reach me." Ruth watched him carefully. No excuse followed. No speech about good intentions. Just the cost. Gideon turned toward the supply barn. "Cut the lock." One of the ranch hands hesitated. Kincaid stepped forward. "You do that, and I will not be responsible for the books afterward." Gideon looked at him. "You won't be responsible for them at all." He pointed toward the office. "Turn over your keys." Kincaid stood still. "Gideon." "Now." For the first time, Kincaid looked uncertain. He reached into his coat and placed a ring of keys into Gideon's hand. "Fine." His eyes moved toward Ruth. "You'll learn quickly that kindness spends easier than it earns," Ruth answered before Gideon could. "This isn't kindness." Kincaid looked at her. "It's keeping an agreement people planned their winter around." Martha stepped down from her wagon. "And paying for bad management with the owner's money instead of ours." No one laughed. Kincaid looked around the yard and seemed to understand that the room he had controlled for years no longer existed. He walked toward the office without another word. Gideon handed the keys to the nearest ranch hand. "Open the barn." The chain dropped minutes later. Work started fast. Hay was counted. Coal sacks were moved. The worst bunkhouse windows were covered. Families were assigned beds according to space rather than rank. Ruth took over a table inside the supply shed and began sorting what was needed where. Not because Gideon told her to, because nobody else had organized it. Martha stood beside her. Pike household needs 2 coal sacks, not 3. Ruth looked up. You're sure? We brought wood. She marked the count. Then 2. Another family needed lamp oil but had flour. A widower from the western cabins had extra blankets but almost no feed. Ruth matched what could be traded before opening more company stock. By midnight, the yard had stopped looking like panic. It looked like work. Gideon came inside carrying a broken crate slat. There's enough hay if we cut 200 head from the south delivery. Ruth looked at him. Will that hold? If the cold breaks within 4 days. And if it doesn't? We cut more. He said it without hesitation. Ruth studied his face. You know what that costs? Yes. You're still doing it. Yes. She lowered her pencil. That's different. He understood what she meant. I should have told you before you ever boarded that stage. Yes. I kept thinking I needed the right time. There isn't one. No. He looked down at the blue stitches along his shoulder. There was just the truth, and I kept delaying it. Ruth closed the supply list. Then don't delay the next one. I won't. The freeze lasted 3 days. No lease family was put out. No winter bunkhouse stayed locked. Vale outfit missed part of the cattle delivery and paid heavily for it. Gideon did not hide the loss. He met with the lease families before the end of the month and replaced Kincaid's shifting winter charges with written seasonal terms agreed before the first frost. Ruth refused to become a decoration beside the owner. She took responsibility for supply allocation and repair schedules because she understood both. By spring, the north bunkhouse roof was finally being replaced. Several lease families worked beside the Vale crew. Ruth stood halfway up a ladder with a plank balanced against her shoulder. Above her, Gideon knelt on the roof in the same worn brown coat. The blue stitches were faded now, but still visible. He reached down. Ruth lifted the board into his hand. Straight? He set it against the frame. Straight. She climbed 1 rung higher and passed him the next. Neither of them looked toward the wide basin stretching beyond the roof. There was still too much work directly in front of them. If Ruth and Gideon's story stayed with you, subscribe and like for more Wild West stories built on earned trust and hard choices.